The autumn sun of 1878 hammered down on Red Mesa trading posts like a blacksmith's anvil, turning the New Mexico dust into copper powder that hung in the air and coated every surface with the color of old blood. The trading post sprawled at the edge of civilization, a collection of weathered timber buildings that leaned into each other like drunken conspirators, their shadows offering no relief from the relentless heat. This was a place where the law arrived late and left early, where men settled disputes with revolvers and whiskey, and where human lives could be bought and sold as easily as beaver pelts or silver ore. The crowd gathered in the center of the compound numbered perhaps 60 souls, though calling them souls seemed generous. They were traders, trappers, prospectors, and drifters, men whose faces had been carved into permanent scowls by wind and disappointment. They pressed forward against the makeshift stage, a collection of crates and planks that groaned under the weight of Buck Reeves, a bounty hunter whose reputation for cruelty had followed him from Texas to the Colorado border. His leather coat hung open despite the heat, revealing a vest studded with silver conchos that caught the sunlight with each movement. His face, weathered to the texture of old saddle leather, split into a grin that showed teeth the color of tobacco stains. Behind him, bound in iron shackles that were far too heavy for her frame, stood Nia Ashki. She was Apache, Chiricahua Apache to be precise, though the crowd cared nothing for such distinctions. To them, Apache meant savage, meant enemy, meant something less than human. But Nia stood with a bearing that suggested she had forgotten to inform anyone of her supposed inferiority. Her long black hair, which should have been tangled and filthy after days of captivity, somehow maintained its dignity, falling past her shoulders in waves that caught the wind. She wore traditional Apache dress, deerskin dyed a deep brown, and decorated with beadwork in patterns that told stories the crowd could not read and would not care to learn. Her face, high cheekboned and proud, bore a small scar across her forehead, a mark from some battle these men would never understand. But it was her eyes that stopped the breath in the chest of anyone who dared meet them directly. Dark as obsidian and twice as sharp, they held no plea for mercy, no trace of fear. Instead, they burned with something that made even the hardest men in the crowd look away. Defiance. Pure, uncut, absolute defiance. Buck Reeves raised his arms like a revival preacher about to deliver salvation, and the crowd's roar softened to a murmur of anticipation. "Gentlemen," Buck's voice carried across the compound with the practiced ease of a man who had sold many things in many places. "What you see before you is a rare opportunity. This here is not just any Apache squaw. Oh no, this is Nia Ashki, daughter of Cochise himself." The crowd's murmur became a wave of exclamations. Cochise. Even men who had never seen an Apache knew that name. The great war chief who had fought the American army to a standstill for over a decade. The leader who had finally made peace on his own terms just 4 years before his death. And this woman was his daughter. "That's right," Buck continued, sensing the shift in the crowd's energy like a wolf sensing wounded prey. "Granddaughter of one of the most dangerous Indians who ever lived. The government up in Fort Lowell is offering $500 for her capture. 500 in silver coin, gentlemen. But I'm a businessman, not a government dog. So I'm offering her to you fine folk for the bargain price of 100 silver dollars. That's right, 100 for a piece of history, 100 for bragging rights that'll last you the rest of your natural days." A voice from the crowd, thick with whiskey and meanness, called out, "What are we supposed to do with her, Buck? Hang her from the nearest tree?" The crowd laughed, a sound like rocks tumbling down a hillside. Buck's grin widened. "Now that's between a man and his conscience. Me, I just catch them. What happens after they're caught? Well, that ain't my concern, though I will say this much. She's killed 2 of my men already. Slit one's throat in the night, broke the other's neck with her bare hands when he got too friendly. So whatever you do with her, I'd keep those shackles on tight." The crowd pressed closer, their faces alive with ugly possibilities. Men reached forward as if to touch her, to confirm she was real. But something in Nia's gaze made their hands fall back. She had not spoken a single word since being dragged onto the stage, but her silence was louder than any scream. It was in this moment, with the crowd working itself into a frenzy of greed and cruelty, that the sound of horses and wheels cut through the K. The crowd turned as one, their attention pulled toward the approaching vehicle with the magnetic force of curiosity and potential threat. Through the shimmering heat came a coach, but not the rough freight wagons common to the territory. This was a Concorde stagecoach, the finest vehicle money could buy in the American West. Its black lacquered sides gleamed despite the dust, and the brass fittings caught the sun like a declaration of wealth. The 6 horses pulling it were not the scrubby Mustangs most men rode, but matched bays with coats that shone like polished mahogany. 2 armed men rode on top, their rifles held with the casual competence of professionals who knew how to use them. The coach rolled to a stop at the edge of the crowd, and for a moment nothing happened. The trading post had gone quiet, that dangerous kind of quiet that precedes violence or revelation. Then the coach door opened. The man who stepped down moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to compensate for old injuries. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet and an inch more, with shoulders that spoke of manual labor in his youth, despite the expensive cut of his clothes. He wore a vest of dark gray wool over a white shirt that somehow remained unstained by travel, and his black coat, though dusty at the hem, was tailored with a precision that could only come from Denver or San Francisco. His face was clean-shaven in an era when most men wore beards, revealing a jaw that might have been carved from granite. His hair, dark brown touched with early gray at the temples, was longer than fashion dictated, but shorter than rebellion. But it was his eyes, gray as river stones after rain, that held the real story. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and forgotten too little. He surveyed the crowd with the detached interest of someone examining livestock at auction. Then his gaze traveled to the stage. When his eyes found Naya, something flickered across his face. Not desire, not cruelty, but something deeper and more complicated. Recognition, perhaps, though not of her specifically. Recognition of a moment he had lived before, or one he had failed to live when it mattered. The 2 armed men from the coach descended and flanked him, their presence not threatening but absolute. The crowd parted without being asked, creating a path to the stage as naturally as water flowing around a stone. Buck Reeves, who had been momentarily struck silent by the interruption, recovered his showman's voice. "Well now, looks like we got ourselves a serious buyer. Welcome, friend. You got a good eye for quality. This here Apache princess is worth every penny, and if you got the coin, she's yours to do with as you please." The man in the expensive coat said nothing. He simply walked forward until he stood at the base of the stage, looking up at Nia. She met his gaze without flinching, and for 3 heartbeats, they existed in a space apart from the crowd, apart from Buck Reeves, apart from everything except the question being asked and answered in that silent exchange. Then the man reached into his coat. Several hands in the crowd moved toward gun belts, but his guards remained calm, which kept the moment from exploding into violence. What he withdrew was not a weapon, but a leather pouch, heavy with weight and possibility. He tossed it onto the stage where it landed with a solid thunk that spoke of serious money. $1,500 in gold coin, the man said. His voice was deep and measured, each word given its proper weight. Plus this. He pulled a folded document from his inner pocket and held it up so Buck could see the official seals. A letter of clemency from the governor of Colorado Territory, pardoning one Naya Ashki of all crimes alleged against her by any territorial or federal authority. Signed, sealed, and legally binding in any court of law. The crowd erupted in confused chatter. $1,500 was a fortune, more than most men earned in 5 years of hard labor. And a gubernatorial pardon. Those didn't come cheap or easy. This man had not simply shown up with money. He had come prepared with the kind of legal firepower that suggested planning, resources, and connections that ran deep. Buck Reeves, for all his bluster, was a practical man. His hands shook slightly as he picked up the leather pouch and loosened the drawstring. Gold coins spilled into his palm, genuine double eagles that caught the sunlight and turned it into liquid fire. He looked at the document, saw the official seals and signatures, and understood that he was looking at more money and more legitimacy than he had ever possessed in his entire miserable life. But Buck was also a mean man, and mean men cannot help but make one last cut even when they have already won. "Well now, Silver Barons," he said, using a title he had clearly heard before. "That's mighty generous of you, mighty generous indeed. But I got to ask, What's a man like you want with an Apache squaw? Your mansion in Denver getting a little cold at night? You need something to warm your bed. The crowd laughed, ugly and knowing. Several men made crude gestures that needed no translation. The man in the expensive coat, this silver baron as Buck had called him, did not react to the insult. Instead, he began walking up the steps to the stage, his slight limp more pronounced with the climb. When he reached the top, he stood face to face with Buck Reeves, and though Buck was not a small man, the stranger seemed to occupy more space, to cast a longer shadow. I am buying her freedom, he said, each word falling like a stone into still water. What she does with that freedom is her choice, not yours, and certainly not mine. As for what I need to look at myself in the mirror tomorrow morning without seeing a coward who stood by and watched murder happen because it was convenient. The silence that followed was so complete that the wind itself seemed to pause. Then the stranger turned to Naya, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. The words that came from his mouth were not English, but Apache, spoken with an accent that suggested long study and genuine respect. Hagone, Whale di Nijoni. Go. The path home is beautiful. Nia's eyes widened. Shock cracked her mask of defiance for just a moment. No white man had spoken Apache to her since her capture. No white man had spoken it with such care, such attention to the proper inflection and meaning. For a heartbeat, she forgot to breathe. The stranger reached into his pocket and withdrew something small and golden. A key, custom made from brass and delicate as jewelry. He approached Nia slowly, the way one might approach a wounded hawk, and knelt before her. The crowd watched in confusion as this wealthy white man, this silver baron who could buy and sell half the trading post without dipping into his savings, knelt in the dust before an Apache woman and gently, carefully unlocked the iron shackles around her wrists. The shackles fell away with a sound like breaking chains, which in truth they were. Nia brought her hands up slowly, seeing them free for the first time in days, seeing the raw red marks where the iron had bitten into her skin. She rubbed her wrists, and for the first time since being dragged onto that stage, she allowed herself to look vulnerable. The stranger stood, pocketed the key, and turned back to Buck. "We're done here," he said. Buck, stuffing gold coins into his pockets with the desperate speed of a man who wanted to be far away before anyone changed their mind, nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir, Mr. Stone. Yes, indeed. Pleasure doing business with you." So the stranger had a name. Stone. It fit him, Nia thought, hard and enduring and marked by time and weather. Mr. Stone gestured toward the coach, an invitation without words. Nia looked from him to the coach to the crowd, which had begun to mutter among themselves with ugly purpose. She understood the calculation instantly. She could run, could try to disappear into the desert on foot, but she was weak from days without proper food or water, and the crowd would run her down like a rabbit. Or she could trust this stranger, this Mr. Stone, who had just spent more money than she had ever seen to purchase something he claimed he was giving away for free. She chose trust, or perhaps she chose survival, and perhaps in that moment they were the same thing. She walked toward the coach, her head held high, refusing to hurry or show fear. Mr. Stone followed at a respectful distance, and his two guards fell in behind, forming a barrier between Naya and the crowd that was becoming more agitated by the second. A voice called out, venomous with whiskey and wounded pride. "You're making a mistake, Stone. She's a killer. Apache don't change. You take her into civilized country, she'll cut your throat first chance she gets." Mr. Stone paused at the coach door, turned, and his gray eyes swept across the crowd with a gaze that seemed to measure each man and find them wanting. "Then I will have died trying to do the right thing," he said, "which is more than most of you can say." He opened the coach door himself, extending a hand to help Naya up, a gesture of courtesy that seemed absurdly formal, given the circumstances. Naya ignored the hand and climbed into the coach under her own power, unwilling to accept help even now. Mr. Stone nodded slightly, as if he had expected nothing less, and climbed in after her. The interior of the coach was as fine as the exterior promised. Red velvet seats, polished wood fittings, and small oil lamps and brass fixtures. There was even a small window with actual glass, wavy and imperfect, but glass nonetheless. It was the kind of vehicle that territorial governors rode in. the kind that spoke of money so deep you could drown in it. Nia pressed herself into the far corner, as far from Mr. Stone as the coach's dimensions allowed. He settled into his seat with a slight wince, his hand going briefly to his right leg, that old injury making itself known. He made no attempt to speak to her, made no move toward her. Instead, he rapped twice on the roof of the coach, and the driver set the horses into motion. The coach rolled out of Red Mesa Trading Post, leaving behind a crowd of confused and angry men who were already beginning to revise the story into something that made them feel less like witnesses to their own cowardice. Buck Reeves was counting his gold coins, already planning how he would drink and gamble away a fortune in less than a month. And somewhere in the back of the crowd, a man with cold blue eyes and a face like a hatchet blade watched the departing coach with the focused intensity of a predator that had just been deprived of its kill. His name was Thaddeus Blackwood, and he was a judge in the territorial court system. He was also the man who had loaned Buck Reeves the money to purchase Naya in the first place, expecting to acquire her through a legal transaction that would have given him leverage over both the Apache people and certain government contracts he had been pursuing. And now Elijah Stone, his former business partner, had just disrupted months of careful planning with a single act of apparent charity. Judge Blackwood smiled, a thin expression that held no warmth. This was not over, not by a considerable distance. Inside the coach, Naya and Elijah Stone rode in silence for the first mile. The only sounds were the creaking of springs, the clip of hooves on hard-packed earth, and the occasional call of the driver to the horses. Nia studied this man who had bought her freedom, trying to understand his game, because it had to be a game. Men like him, white men with money and power, they did not simply help Apache women out of the goodness of their hearts. There had to be an angle, a purpose, a price that would be revealed when she was far from any chance of escape. Finally, Elijah reached into his coat again. Naya tensed, her hand moving instinctively toward the knife she no longer carried, taken from her during her capture. But what he withdrew was not a weapon. It was a folded piece of paper, thick and official-looking, covered in dense type and bearing multiple seals and signatures. "This is a deed of freedom," Elijah said, speaking English now, his voice still carrying that careful, measured quality. "It's a legal document that proves you are not property, not a prisoner, and not subject to any bounty or warrant in the territories of Colorado or New Mexico. I've had it witnessed by a notary public, sealed by the territorial governor, and registered with the federal marshal's office. In the eyes of the law, as much as the law has eyes, you are free." He held the document out to her. Naya did not take it immediately, her eyes moving from the paper to his face, searching for the trap. "There is no obligation attached to this freedom," Elijah continued. "When we stop tonight, you can leave. Walk into the desert, head south to Apache lands. Go wherever you choose. Or you can stay with me until we reach my ranch in Colorado. It's a safe place, as safe as anywhere can be. You can rest there, recover your strength, and decide your next move. The choice is yours." "White men don't give things for free," Naya said. Her English was perfect, unaccented, which clearly surprised Elijah, though he tried to hide it. "There is always a price, always something owed. What do you want from me?" Elijah was quiet for a long moment. He looked out the window at the passing landscape, at the red earth and scattered sagebrush, at the mountains rising in the distance like promises or threats, depending on your perspective. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, become softer, weighted with something that might have been grief or regret or both. "5 years ago," he said, "I had a wife, Margaret, and a daughter, Sarah. She was 7 years old, blonde hair like her mother, but my eyes, everyone said, my gray eyes. They died in the plague of 1873. Pneumonic, the doctors called it. It moved through Denver like wildfire through dry grass. I was in the San Juan Mountains when it happened, negotiating mineral rights for a silver mine. I was making us rich, you see, making sure my wife and daughter would never want for anything. When I got the telegram, they had already been dead 3 days, buried in a mass grave with 60 other victims because the ground was frozen and they were running out of space." He turned back to look at Nia, and she saw something in his eyes that made her hand relax its instinctive search for a weapon that was not there. Pain. deep and ancient and still bleeding, despite 5 years of time attempting to scab it over. I don't want anything from you, Elijah said. I can't want anything from you. I have more money than I can spend, more property than I can manage, and more guilt than I can carry. What I want is to live with myself, to look in the mirror tomorrow and not see a man who stood by and watched another human being destroyed for the entertainment of animals in human shape. So no, Miss Ashkey, there is no price. The only debt here is mine, and I'm trying to pay it forward because I can never pay it back. Naya took the document. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes moving across words she could read and legal phrases she could partially understand. It looked legitimate. The seals looked real, but still she could not quite believe it. Why do you speak Apache? She asked. My wife was Shoshone Ochvorni, Elijah said. Northern Shoshone from up near Fort Hall. Her people and yours, you're cousins in a way. Different languages, different customs, but cousins nonetheless. She taught me to respect the old ways, the languages, the traditions. After she died, I kept studying, kept learning. It made me feel closer to her, I suppose. Or maybe it was just something to fill the empty hours. For the first time since Buck Reeves had dragged her onto that stage, Nia felt something other than rage or fear. She felt the faintest stirring of possibility. Not trust, not yet, but the small crack in the wall that might someday let trust enter. I am Nia Ashkey, she said, speaking her full name for the first time to this man. Daughter of Cochise, who led our people in war and peace. Daughter of Dos Te Se, who could heal wounds with herbs and prayer. I am not weak. I am not helpless. If you think to make me your servant or your woman because you paid gold, you will find that I am neither. I would expect nothing less, Elijah said, nor would I wish for anything different. They rode on as the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold that made the whole world look like it had been dipped in molten metal. Neither of them spoke for another hour, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of predator and prey, or captor and captive. It was simply the silence of two people who had said what needed saying and were now waiting to see what would happen next. As the light began to fade, Elijah rapped on the ceiling again, and the coach slowed. One of the guards rode up beside the window. Boss, there's a good camping spot about 2 miles ahead. Spring-fed creek, some cover. Should be safe for the night. Make for it, Elijah said. And Frank, keep double watch tonight. I suspect we may have company before morning. The guard, Frank, nodded and spurred his horse forward. Naya looked at Elijah sharply. You expect them to follow? Men like Buck Reeves don't let go of $1,500 easily, Elijah said. They tell themselves I stole it, that the transaction wasn't legitimate, that they deserve a second chance at the prize. And Judge Blackwood, who was standing in the back of that crowd wearing clothes too fine for a trading post and watching too intently to be there by accident, he's not the kind of man who accepts defeat gracefully. You know this, Judge? I used to. We were partners once in the early days when I was just starting to make money in silver. He provided legal services, I provided capital. Then I discovered he was embezzling from our shared accounts, using company funds to bribe other officials, and engaging in what polite society calls sharp practices and honest men call theft. I dissolved the partnership and made sure certain people knew about his activities. He's hated me ever since. So he will come, Nia said. It was not a question. Probably, Elijah agreed, which is why we'll be ready. The camp was established with military efficiency. The guards, whose names were Frank and Thomas, had clearly done this many times before. They unhitched the horses, set up a perimeter with small bells on tripwires, and built a fire that was small enough to not be seen from a distance, but large enough to boil coffee and heat beans. Elijah moved around the camp with the easy competence of someone who had spent time in the wilderness despite his obvious wealth. He carried his own bedroll, filled his own canteen, and tended his own horse with the kind of care that spoke of genuine affection for the animal. Naya watched all this from a position near the creek, where she had gone to wash the dirt and sweat of captivity from her skin. The water was cold, fed from mountain snowmelt, and it stung her raw wrists where the shackles had chewed into flesh. But the pain was cleansing, focusing. It reminded her that she was alive when she had expected to be dead. When she returned to the fire, Elijah had set out a bedroll for her, positioned on the opposite side of the fire from his own, with the horses between them as a barrier. A canteen of water and a plate of beans and hardtack sat on a flat stone nearby. He had not waited for her to return, had not tried to serve her or watch her eat. He had simply provided and stepped away, giving her space to choose. Naya sat and ate slowly, her stomach protesting the sudden influx of food after days of near starvation. Across the fire, Elijah sat with his back against his saddle, a small leather-bound notebook in his hands. He was writing something by the firelight, his hand moving with the careful precision of someone who documented his life on paper. "What do you write?" Naya asked. She was not sure why she asked. Perhaps because the silence had gone on long enough, or perhaps because she genuinely wanted to know. Elijah looked up, surprised that she had initiated conversation. "Accounts," he said. "Expenses, income, debts owed and debts paid. I've kept a ledger since I was 16 years old and working as an assistant to a mining engineer. It's a habit that served me well. Every dollar earned, every dollar spent. It keeps me honest with myself if no one else." "And what will you write about today?" Elijah considered the question, then smiled slightly, a small expression that barely moved his mouth but changed his whole face. $1,500 in gold, spent on the best investment I've made in 5 years. Naya did not smile back, but something in her posture softened fractionally. She finished her meal in silence, then moved to her bedroll. She lay down facing the fire, but her eyes never closed, never stopped watching. She had learned long ago that sleep was a luxury prisoners could not afford. Across the fire, Elijah continued writing for another hour, then closed his notebook and settled into his own bedroll. But Naya noticed that he kept his hand near his revolver, and his eyes, though closed, moved beneath their lids like he was tracking movement in dreams. The night deepened. The fire burned down to coals, and in the darkness beyond the camp's small circle of light, something moved. Not the random movement of wildlife, but the purposeful movement of men on horseback, trying to approach silently and failing because horses are not silent creatures no matter how carefully they are ridden. Frank, who had first watch, gave a low whistle. Both Thomas and Elijah were awake instantly, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who had faced danger before. Naya was already sitting up, her hand closed around a large rock because she had no better weapon. From the darkness, a voice called out. It was Buck Reeves, his words slurred with whiskey, but his intent crystal clear. "Stone, you cheating snake! You think you can rob me and ride away clean? That Apache whore is worth more than you paid. I want compensation. I want another $1,000, or I want her back. You got till I count to 10 to decide." Elijah stood, his revolver now visible in his hand though not yet raised. "Buck, go home. You've been paid more than fairly, and you know it. Ride away, and we'll forget this happened. Press this, and you'll regret it." Buck's laugh was ugly. "Big talk from a cripple. I got 6 men with me, Stone, 6 against your 3, and that Apache girl don't count for nothing." Naya stood, the rock still in her hand, her body coiled like a spring waiting to release. "I count," she said, her voice carrying into the darkness. "I count for more than all of you combined." There was a moment of shocked silence. Then Buck's voice came again, angrier now. "You taught the savage to talk back? Boy, you got even worse problems than I thought. Last chance, Stone? Money or the girl?" "Neither," Elijah said, and his voice had gone cold as mountain ice. "Thomas, light the charges." Thomas struck a match and touched it to 3 fuses that Naya had not noticed being laid out during the camp's construction. The fuses caught and raced away into the darkness with a hiss of burning powder. 5 seconds later, 3 small explosions erupted in a semicircle around the camp's perimeter. Not large enough to kill, but plenty large enough to spook horses. The darkness beyond the firelight erupted into chaos. Horses screamed and bucked. Men cursed and fought to maintain control of animals that had decided their riders were trying to get them killed. More curses, the sound of at least one man hitting the ground hard, and then the thunder of hooves at Buck's men scattered into the night, their courage evaporating like morning dew under a hot sun. Buck Reeves' voice rose above the confusion, promising vengeance and retribution, but it was the empty threat of a man who had lost and knew it. Within 2 minutes, the sound of fleeing horses had faded into the distance, leaving only the nervous stamping of the camp's own animals and the ringing silence that follows violence averted. Elijah lowered his revolver and looked at Nia. "You count," he said simply. "Don't ever doubt it." Nia nodded slowly, her hands still tight around the rock. She had seen many things in her life, had survived battles and betrayals in the slow genocide of her people. But she had never seen a white man fight to protect her when he had nothing to gain and everything to lose. The calculus of her understanding was shifting, recalibrating around this new and unexpected data point. "We should move at first light," Frank said, checking his rifle. "Buck won't come back tonight, but come morning he might grow a spine again." "Agreed," Elijah said. He looked at Naya. "Can you ride? We'll make better time with you on your own horse rather than in the coach, Vaughn." "I was riding before you were born," Naya said, and there was the faintest hint of humor in her voice, dry as desert sand but present nonetheless. "Then we'll mount you on Storm," Elijah said. "He's spirited, but he'll listen if you speak to him right." The rest of the night passed without incident, though no one truly slept. At first light, they broke camp with the efficient haste of people who knew they were being hunted. Elijah gave Naya a gray Mustang stallion with eyes that showed intelligence and a certain wildness that had not been completely tamed. She mounted without help, settling into the saddle like she was returning home, and the horse immediately calmed under her touch. They rode hard for Silver Pine Ranch, covering ground at a pace that ate up miles but left the horses winded. By the time the sun reached its apex, they had left the desert behind and entered the foothills of the San Juan Mountains. The land here was different, greener, with stands of aspen that turned the whole world gold in the autumn light. Pine trees began to appear, giving the air a scent of resin and earth that was almost intoxicating after days in the dust. It was mid-afternoon when they crested a ridge and Elijah reined in his horse, gesturing ahead. "Silver Pine Ranch," he said. Naya looked, and her breath caught despite her determination to remain unmoved. The ranch spread across a valley like something from a dream or a lie. The main house was 2 stories of whitewashed wood and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped her around 3 sides and windows that reflected the afternoon sun in geometric patterns. The architecture was Victorian, ornate without being ostentatious, speaking of wealth that was comfortable with itself. Outbuildings dotted the property, a stable large enough for 20 horses, a bunkhouse for workers, a barn, a smokehouse, and several storage sheds. Fences, clean and well-maintained, marked off pastures where horse grazed on grass that was still green despite the late season. It was a kingdom in miniature, carved from wilderness by money and will. And it was more than Naya had ever imagined any single man could own. "All this is yours?" she asked, and her voice held something she had not intended to reveal. Not quite awe, but certainly recognition of the vast gulf between her world and his. "All this is built on the blood of miners and the sweat of men who died underground, so I could profit from the silver they pulled from stone," Elijah said quietly. "Yes, it's mine. But there's not a day I don't ask myself what right I had to profit from so much suffering." They rode down into the valley in silence. As they approached the house, a woman emerged onto the porch. She was perhaps 55 years old, with hair gone gray and bound in a practical bun, wearing a simple dress of dark blue cotton covered by a work apron. Her face was weathered but kind, with lines that spoke of smiling more than frowning. When she saw the group approaching, her expression shifted from curiosity to concern to something that might have been understanding. "Elijah Stone," she called out as they dismounted. "What have you done now?" "Rosa, meet Miss Nia Ashkey," Elijah said. "Miss Ashkey, this is Rosa Delgado. She runs this household and has been known to run me when circumstances require it." Rosa Delgado walked down from the porch, her eyes taking in Naya's appearance, with the practiced assessment of someone who had seen hardship before. Then she did something that shocked Nia down to her bones. She spoke in Apache. The accent was not perfect, but the intent was clear. "Ya ate, Shadiji." "Hello, my younger sister." Nia's defenses, which had been slowly eroding since Red Mesa, cracked further. "You are Apache?" "My mother was," Rosa said, switching to English. "My father was Mexican. I am what the world calls half-breed, though I never felt particularly divided. Mr. Stone employs me not out of charity, but because I work harder than any three men. You are welcome here, little sister, for as long as you wish to stay. Tears, unbidden and unwelcome, burned at the corners of Nia's eyes. She blinked them back with fierce determination, but not before Rosa had seen them. The older woman simply nodded, as if she understood every wound that was bleeding and every scar that had never quite healed. Come, Rosa said. You need food, a bath, and sleep, in that order. Mr. Stone, you can explain your latest act of magnificent foolishness after I've gotten this child settled. Yes, ma'am, Elijah said meekly, and for the first time, Naya saw something like fondness in his expression. This Rosa Delgado, she held a place in his life that was more than employee and less than family, something in between that defied easy categorization. They entered the house, and if the outside had been impressive, the inside was overwhelming. Hardwood floors polished to a mirror shine, furniture upholstered in fabric that must have cost more than most families earned in a year, a staircase that curved upward with carved banisters, and everywhere the small touches that spoke of careful attention, vases with fresh flowers, paintings on the walls, lamps with glass shades that caught the light and transformed it into rainbows. But Naya noticed something else too. Despite all this wealth, there was an emptiness to the house. Not dirty or neglected, but hollow, like a church after the congregation has gone home. The house was waiting for something it had lost and did not know how to reclaim. Rosa led Nia upstairs to a room that had clearly been prepared in anticipation. A bed with a real mattress, covered in quilts that had been hand-stitched with patterns of extraordinary complexity. A wardrobe holding dresses that would need to be taken in, but were good quality nonetheless. A washstand with pitcher and basin. And most remarkably, a door with no lock on the outside, only on the inside. This is your room, Rosa said. No one will enter without your permission. The door locks only from the inside, and you hold the only key. If you wish to leave, the front door is never locked. Day or night, you are free to go wherever you choose. Nia touched the door, ran her fingers over the lock mechanism, and understood what this meant. Elijah Stone was not just offering her shelter, he was offering her proof. Physical, undeniable proof that she was not a prisoner. After Rosa left to prepare food, Naya explored the room more thoroughly, and that's when she found them. On the dresser, carefully arranged as if someone visited them often, were a child's belongings. A hairbrush with blonde strands still caught in the bristles. A music box that played a tinkling melody when opened. A photograph in a silver frame, showing a man who was clearly Elijah, but younger, less weathered, smiling genuinely. Beside him was a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a child, perhaps 6 or 7, with blonde ringlets in Elijah's gray eyes. His wife and daughter, the ones who had died 5 years ago. The grief he carried like stones in his pockets. And suddenly, Naya understood. This was not her room. This was Sarah's room, the daughter's room, preserved like a shrine, untouched by time or change. And Elijah was giving it to her. Not as a replacement for his daughter, but as an act of faith, an acknowledgement that this space, which had held only grief and memory, might hold life again. The weight of that gift, that trust, that desperate hope for something beyond survival settled onto Naya's shoulders like a blanket woven from complicated obligations. She sat on the bed, her hand touching the quilt, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to cry. Not the desperate tears of captivity or loss, but the overwhelmed tears of someone who has been holding on to anger for so long that when it finally begins to release, the space left behind is vertiginous and strange. Downstairs, Elijah stood on the porch with Rosa, looking out at the mountains as the sun began its descent toward evening. In his hand was a small wooden doll carved by hand that he had been working on for 5 years and had never been able to finish. He turned it over in his fingers, studying the incomplete face, the rough edges that needed smoothing. You brought home a world of trouble, Rosa said quietly. I know. Judge Blackwood will come for her, and when he does, he'll bring the full weight of territorial law with him. I know that too. You could lose everything, the ranch, the mine, your standing in Denver society. They will call you a traitor to your race for protecting an Apache woman. I've already lost everything that mattered, Elijah said. Everything else is just property and pretense. But maybe if I do this right, I can find something worth protecting, something worth the price it will cost. Rosa put her hand on his shoulder. Then we will pay that price together. But you should know, Elijah, that girl up there, she is strong, but she is also hurt in ways that will take years to heal. Don't mistake her presence for acceptance or her silence for trust. You have opened the door, but she will take a long time to walk through it. Then I'll wait, Elijah said. He looked down at the unfinished doll in his hand, then slipped it back into his pocket. I've gotten good at waiting. As night fell over Silver Pine Ranch, three people settled into an uneasy coexistence under the same roof. Elijah in his study, working through account books and trying to prepare for the legal battles he knew were coming. Rosa in the kitchen, preparing more food than was strictly necessary because cooking was her way of showing care. And Naya in Sarah's room, sitting by the window and watching the stars emerge one by one over the mountains, wondering how her life had brought her to this impossible place, and what price would eventually be demanded for the freedom she was only beginning to believe might actually be real. And far to the south, in a comfortable office in a building that proclaimed itself the seat of territorial justice, Judge Thaddeus Blackwood sat at his desk and composed a letter. A letter that would set in motion events that would test every decision, every promise, and every fragile new alliance that had been formed in the dusty heat of Red Mesa Trading Post. The game was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than anyone yet realized. The morning after Naya's arrival at Silver Pine Ranch came with a sky so clear it looked like blue glass, the kind of autumn morning that makes promises the coming winter will brutally break. Elijah Stone woke in his study, where he had fallen asleep over account books and legal documents, his neck stiff from sleeping in a leather chair designed for sitting rather than slumber. The house was quiet in that particular way that speaks of other people being awake, but choosing silence. And when he made his way to the kitchen, he found Rosa already preparing breakfast with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done this task so many times it had become a form of meditation. She's been up for 2 hours, Rosa said without turning from the stove where eggs sizzled in bacon fat. Walked the entire perimeter of the property, checked every fence line, every outbuilding, every possible exit. She's memorizing escape routes. Elijah poured himself coffee from the pot Rosa always had ready, black and strong enough to wake the dead. Can't say I blame her. 5 years ago, I would have done the same. 5 years ago, you did do the same, Rosa pointed out. When you first came here after Margaret and Sarah died, you spent 3 months walking this land like you were looking for a door that would let you out of your own skin. Elijah said nothing because Rosa was right, and they both knew it. He took his coffee to the window and looked out across the ranch. In the distance, near the horse paddock, he could see Naya. She stood with her back to the house, her long black hair loose and moving in the morning breeze, watching the horses with an intensity that suggested she was seeing something beyond mere animals. She hasn't eaten, Rosa continued. I left food out for her. She looked at it like it might be poisoned, then walked away. She trusts nothing yet. Maybe not for a long time. Then we give her time, Elijah said. Time is a luxury you may not have, Rosa said, and her voice carried a warning. I heard Thomas talking to Frank last night. They saw riders watching the property from the ridge yesterday evening. 3 men on horseback, just watching. They didn't come closer, but they were there long enough to be noticed. Elijah's jaw tightened. Blackwood's men, or Buck Reeves, growing a spine now that he's had time to drink away his fear. Either way, you need to prepare. They will come, Elijah. The question is when and how, not if. Before Elijah could respond, there was a knock at the front door. Not the tentative knock of a friend or the aggressive pounding of an enemy, but the official, measured knock of someone who represented authority. Elijah and Rosa exchanged glances. It was barely past dawn. Official business arriving this early was never good news. Elijah opened the door to find a young man in a deputy's uniform, his face apologetic but his posture rigid with the discomfort of someone delivering bad news. He held a sealed envelope embossed with the territorial court's official seal. Mr. Stone, I'm Deputy Mitchell. I have a legal summons for you, sir. I'm required to deliver it in person and confirm receipt. Elijah took the envelope, broke the seal, and read quickly. His face, which had been calm if guarded, went still in a way that Rosa recognized as dangerous. It was the stillness of a man calculating odds and not liking what his arithmetic revealed. This summons requires me to appear in Denver within 3 days, Elijah said, his voice flat. It also orders me to produce one Naya Ashkey for questioning regarding alleged crimes against settlers in the New Mexico territory. Failure to comply will result in seizure of property and assets pending investigation. Deputy Mitchell shifted uncomfortably. Sir, I'm just delivering the papers. I don't know the details of the case. Of course you don't, Elijah said, but there was no anger in his voice, just weariness. Tell Judge Blackwood that I received his summons and will respond appropriately. The deputy nodded, relieved to have his duty discharged, and departed with the haste of someone eager to be away from gathering storms. Elijah closed the door and stood for a moment with his back to Rosa, his shoulders tight with tension. He's moving faster than I expected, Elijah said finally. I thought we'd have at least a week before he made his legal move. But Blackwood never was patient when he smelled blood in the water. What will you do? What I should have done years ago, Elijah said, turning to face her. I'm going to Denver. I'm going to meet with Harrison Webb, the only lawyer in the territory I trust. And I'm going to find out exactly what legal ground Blackwood thinks he's standing on so I can pull it out from under him. And Miss Ashkey? She stays here, with you and the guards. She's safer on this ranch than anywhere else, and taking her to Denver would be walking into Blackwood's trap with my eyes open. Rosa nodded slowly. She won't like being left behind. It will feel like being caged again. Then you'll have to explain it to her, Elijah said, because she'll believe you before she believes me. They found Naya in the stable, grooming the gray Mustang stallion with long, careful strokes that spoke of genuine affection for the animal. She looked up when they entered, her body immediately tensing into a defensive posture even though neither of them had made any threatening move. Miss Ashkey, Elijah began, then stopped, searching for words that would not sound like commands or manipulation. I need to go to Denver. There are legal matters that require my immediate attention, matters that concern your presence here. Naya's hand stilled on the horse's flank. They are coming for me. They are trying to use the law as a weapon, Elijah said, but the law can be a shield as well, if you know how to wield it. I have a lawyer in Denver, a good man named Harrison Webb. He'll help us understand what we're facing and how to counter it. You should take me to them, Nia said flatly. Save yourself the trouble, save your property, and you're standing with your people. No, Elijah said, in the single word carried absolute finality. I brought you here. I gave you my word that you were free. That word means something, Miss Ashkey. It means I don't surrender you to men who want to use you as a political pawn or a trophy. It means I fight. Why? The question burst from Naya with surprising force. Why do you fight for me? You do not know me. I am nothing to you. Your people and my people are enemies. This makes no sense. Elijah was quiet for a long moment, considering how much truth to share and how much to keep buried. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and heavy with old grief. 5 years ago, when my wife and daughter died, I was not there. I was chasing money, pursuing deals, building an empire of silver and influence. I told myself I was doing it for them, providing for their future. But the truth is, I was doing it for myself, for my pride. And when they needed me most, I was 3 days away and unreachable. He stepped closer, not crowding Naya, but closing the distance enough that she could see the pain etched into the lines of his face. I can't save them. They're gone, and no amount of money or power will bring them back. But I can save you. I can stand between you and the people who want to destroy you for their own gain. And maybe, just maybe, if I do this right, I can look at myself in the mirror and see something other than a coward who chose gold over the people he loved. The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the soft breathing of horses and the distant call of a crow. Naya studied Elijah's face, searching for deception or manipulation, but finding only raw honesty that made her uncomfortable because it demanded honesty in return. My father used to say that a man's worth is not measured by his words, but by what he does when words have failed. Naya said finally, You speak well, Elijah Stone, but I have known many white men who spoke well before they brought death to my people. I do not yet know if you are different. Then let me prove it, Elijah said. Stay here. Be safe. Let me go to Denver and fight this legal battle. And when I return, we'll decide together what comes next. Naya wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she needed no protection, that she could fight her own battles. But the truth, which she hated to acknowledge even to herself, was that she was exhausted. Exhausted from running, from fighting, from the constant vigilance that survival demanded. In this place, this impossible ranch with its impossible owner offered something she had not felt in years. Not safety exactly, but the possibility of safety. The chance to lower her guard, if only for a moment. I will stay, she said finally. But not because you command it, because I choose it. There is a difference. I know, Elijah said, and that difference matters more than you realize. He left within the hour, taking Frank with him as a guard and leaving Thomas to watch over the ranch. The Concord coach rolled down the valley road, carrying Elijah toward Denver and whatever legal machinations Judge Blackwood had prepared. Nia watched from the porch until the coach disappeared from view, then turned to find Rosa standing beside her with a knowing expression. He will come back, Rosa said. Elijah Stone may be many things, but he has never broken a promise. Not once in all the years I have known him. All men break promises, Nia said bitterly. The question is only when and how badly. Then let him surprise you, Rosa said. The world is cruel enough without assuming the worst of everyone who tries to do right. The days that followed developed their own rhythm. Nia rose before dawn each morning, walking the property with the methodical thoroughness of someone mapping terrain for future battles. She learned where the fence lines ran, where the creeks provided water, where the forest was thick enough to hide in, and where the open ground left her exposed. Thomas watched her from a distance, his hand never far from his rifle, but he made no move to restrict her movements or question her purpose. Rosa, meanwhile, began a campaign of gentle domestication that Naya recognized but could not quite resist. She would leave fresh bread on the kitchen table with butter and honey, positioned where Nia would pass it on her morning walks. She would mention casually that there was venison stew keeping warm on the stove if anyone happened to be hungry. She would find excuses to work near wherever Nia was, not speaking unless spoken to, but providing a quiet presence that was somehow comforting rather than intrusive. Slowly, grudgingly, Nia began to accept these offerings. A piece of bread taken while Rosa's back was turned, a bowl of stew eaten standing up as if she might need to flee at any moment. And finally, on the fourth day, sitting at the kitchen table while Rosa kneaded bread dough, the two women sharing a meal in companionable silence. You were married, Rosa said eventually, not a question but a gentle opening. Nia stiffened. Why do you say this? The way you touch things, the way you organize the items in your room, always in pairs, always with space between them, like you're leaving room for someone else's belongings. These are the habits of someone who once shared space with another person. For a long moment, Nia said nothing. Then perhaps because Rosa had shared her own mixed heritage, perhaps because the silence had grown heavy with the weight of untold stories, she spoke. His name was Naiche. He was a warrior, nephew of Cochise, my cousin. We were to be married after the summer hunt, but the soldiers came. They burned our village, killed the men, took the women and children to the reservation. Naiche died fighting to protect the elders. He was 20 years old. I'm sorry, Rosa said simply. Not the elaborate condolences white people often gave, full of empty phrases and uncomfortable sympathy, just two words that carried genuine understanding. My mother died that same day, Nia continued, the words coming faster now as if a dam had broken. She was a healer. She ran into a burning lodge to save children trapped inside. The roof collapsed. They say she saved 4 children before the flames took her. That is how I want to remember her. Not as a victim, but as someone who chose courage even when courage meant death. That is a good way to remember, Rosa said. She worked the bread dough with strong, practiced movements, the rhythm seeming to give structure to the conversation. Elijah's wife, Margaret, she was like that too, strong. When the plague came, she worked alongside the doctors in Denver, treating the sick even though she knew she might catch the disease herself. And she did catch it. But before she died, she saved 6 other children who recovered. Elijah has never forgiven himself for not being there, but I think Margaret would have been proud that he's trying to honor her memory by protecting you. I am not his dead wife, Nia said sharply. I will not be some replacement for his grief. No, Rosa agreed. You are not. And he does not see you that way. But we are all shaped by our losses, Nia. They teach us what matters and what is worth fighting for. Elijah's loss taught him that money and power mean nothing if you use them only for yourself. Perhaps your loss taught you something similar. Nia had no answer to that, so she remained silent. But something in her chest, something that had been frozen solid for 3 years, began to thaw just slightly. On the 5th day, as Nia was working with the horses in the paddock, teaching a young mare to accept a saddle through patience rather than force, Thomas called out a warning. Riders approaching from the south. 3 of them, moving with the casual confidence of men who were not trying to hide their presence. Nia's hand went instinctively to her belt, where a knife would have been if she had one. Thomas emerged from the bunkhouse with his rifle, his face set in grim lines. Rosa appeared on the porch, drying her hands on her apron, but her eyes hard as flint. The riders came to a stop at the property line, making no move to cross onto stone land without permission. Buck Reeves sat in the middle, his face still bearing bruises from where he had fallen from his horse during the abortive attack on the camp. On his left was a man Nia had not seen before, tall and rail-thin, with cold blue eyes that evaluated everything they touched with the dispassionate calculation of a snake deciding whether something was prey. On his right rode Iron Hand Moss, a massive man whose hands, as his nickname suggested, looked like they could crush skulls without effort. Well now, Buck called out, his voice carrying false friendliness. This is a nice spread Stone's got here. Real nice. Must be lonely, though, with him gone off to Denver and leaving just you folks to mind the store. Thomas raised his rifle slightly, not pointing it directly at the men, but making his capability clear. State your business or ride on. You're not welcome here. Business, Buck said, his grin widening. That's a good word. See, I got business with that Apache girl. Unfinished business. Stone may have thrown enough money around to confuse things temporarily, but the law's the law. And the law says Indians found off reservation land can be detained and returned to proper authority. She has papers, Rosa called out, legal documents signed by the territorial governor. She is free and under the protection of Elijah Stone's household. The thin man with the cold eyes spoke for the first time. His voice was soft, almost gentle, which somehow made it more menacing. Papers can be challenged, governors can be overruled, and protection only works if the protector is present, which Mr. Stone is not. And who might you be? Thomas asked, his rifle now pointed more directly at the thin man. Colt Driscoll, the man said, former Army scout, current independent contractor. I'm here as a professional courtesy to inform you that Judge Blackwood has issued a warrant for the detention of one Nia Ashkey pending investigation of alleged crimes. We're authorized to take her into custody. You can surrender her peacefully, or we can come back with 20 men and fire. Your choice. Nia stepped forward, her voice cutting across the distance between them with the sharp edge of defiance. I am Nia Ashkey, daughter of Cochise. I do not hide behind others. If you want me, come and take me yourselves rather than sending threats like cowards. Iron Hand Moss laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. She's got spirit, I like that. Makes breaking them more satisfying. Something flickered in Colt Driscoll's cold eyes, a calculation being made. Then he nodded slightly to Buck. We'll be back. Tell Stone that when he returns, if he returns, he'll find his property confiscated and his Apache whore in custody. Judge Blackwood doesn't take kindly to being challenged, and Stone just made himself a very powerful enemy. They turned their horses and rode away, but the threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had not yet been fully extinguished. Thomas lowered his rifle but did not relax his vigilance. Rosa came down from the porch, her face troubled. They're testing us, Thomas said, seeing what kind of resistance they'll face. Next time, they'll come with more men and less conversation. Then we prepare, Nia said. She looked at Thomas with an intensity that made him recognize, perhaps for the first time, that this was not some helpless woman in need of rescue, but a warrior who had simply been temporarily disarmed. You know this land. I know how to fight. Together we make them pay for every step they take onto this property. Miss Ashkey, Thomas began, Mr. Stone wouldn't want you putting yourself in danger. Mr. Stone is not here, Naya said flatly, and I have been in danger every day of my life since I was 16 years old. At least here, I choose the ground I fight on. Over the next 2 days, the ranch transformed into something approaching a fortress. Nia showed Thomas and Rosa techniques the Apache had perfected over generations of defending against superior numbers. They strung thin wires at ankle height across likely approaches, wires that would trip horses and send riders crashing to the ground. They positioned bells made from tin cans filled with pebbles along fence lines, primitive but effective early warning systems. They identified firing positions with clear lines of sight and fallback routes through terrain that looked open but contained hidden gullies and ravines. Thomas, who had served in the army before hiring on with Stone, recognized the tactical sophistication of what Naya was creating. You've done this before, he said. Not a question, but an acknowledgement. Many times, Naya said. My people have been fighting for survival since before you were born. We learned to make every rock a weapon, every shadow a shield. Your white man's way of war is to gather large numbers and overwhelm with force. Our way is to make every encounter so costly that even victory becomes defeat. Stone's lucky to have you on his side. Stone has not yet proven he is on my side, Naya corrected. He has made promises. Promises are air until they are tested. On the seventh day, as the sun was setting and painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost unreal in their intensity, a single rider appeared on the horizon. For a moment, tension spiked, hands reaching for weapons. Then Thomas lowered his rifle. It's Frank, coming back from Denver. Alone. The word alone hung heavy with implication. If Frank had returned without Elijah, that suggested something had gone wrong. Nia felt something twist in her chest, an emotion she did not want to name. Not concern for Elijah Stone specifically, she told herself, but concern for what his absence would mean for her own situation. Frank rode into the yard at a gallop, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. He dismounted before the animal had fully stopped, his face grim. Where's Miss Ashkey? Right here, Naya said, stepping from the shadows where she had been watching. Where is Stone? In jail, Frank said, and the words fell like hammer blows. Judge Blackwood moved faster than we thought. He had Stone arrested the moment we arrived in Denver. Charged him with harboring a fugitive, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and about 6 other things I couldn't even understand. Harrison Webb, the lawyer, he's working to get Stone released, but Blackwood's got friends on the territorial Supreme Court. It could be days, maybe weeks. Rosa made a sound like she had been struck. Thomas swore quietly but with feeling. Nia felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not literally but metaphorically, as the fragile structure of safety she had been building collapsed back into familiar chaos. So he abandons me, Nia said, her voice bitter. He makes promises and then disappears when keeping them becomes difficult, just like all white men. No, Frank said sharply, you don't understand. Before they took him, Stone had time to give me something. He told me to give it directly to you, no matter what anyone else said. He reached into his coat and withdrew a sealed envelope, thick with multiple pages. He said to tell you that the only debt here is his, and he's paying it whether Blackwood likes it or not. Nia took the envelope with hands that wanted to shake but refused to show weakness. She broke the seal and unfolded the documents inside. Her English reading was good but not perfect, so Rosa moved beside her, helping to translate the legal language into plain speech. The first document was a deed, a property deed registered with the Territorial Land Office, transferring ownership of 50% of the Devil's Throat silver mine from Elijah Stone to a newly established entity called the Ashkey Apache Heritage Trust. The mine, according to the valuation listed, was worth approximately $300,000. 50% of that was $150,000, more money than Nia had ever conceived of existing in one place. The second document was even more startling. It was a letter of instruction to Harrison Webb, authorizing him to use any and all of Stone's remaining assets, including the ranch itself if necessary, to fight for Nia's legal freedom and to establish a formal peace treaty between the Apache people and the territorial government. The third document was a personal letter written in Elijah's precise handwriting. "Miss Ashkey," Rosa read aloud, her voice catching slightly. "If you are reading this, then Blackwood has moved against me before I could move against him. I am not surprised. He has always been 3 steps ahead when it comes to using the law as a weapon. But he made one critical error. He assumed I would value my property and position more than I value keeping my word to you. I do not. The documents accompanying this letter transfer half ownership of my primary mine to a trust established in your name and for the benefit of your people. I do this freely and without expectation of return. If you think I saved you for business reasons, then I strip away those reasons. If you believe I am using you for political advantage, then I surrender that advantage. The mine is yours. The money it generates is yours. Use it to build schools, hospitals, farms, whatever your people need. I want nothing except the knowledge that I kept my promise, that I stood between you and those who would destroy you, and I did not break. Whatever happens to me in this Denver jail does not matter. What matters is that you are free, truly free, with resources to make that freedom mean something. I have already lost everything that mattered to me once. Money and property are just things. They can be replaced or surrendered. But my word, my honor, my commitment to do right by you, those cannot be taken unless I surrender them. And I do not surrender. Yours in respect and hope, Elijah Stone." The silence that followed was profound. Nia stared at the papers in her hands. These documents that represented more wealth than her entire tribe had possessed in its collective history, given freely with no strings attached. Given as proof. Given as an act of faith so absolute that it terrified her. "He gave away half his fortune," Thomas said, his voice awed. "Just like that. To prove a point." "Not to prove a point," Rosa said quietly. "To prove his word. There is a difference." Nia felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking but opening, like ice giving way to spring water. She had spent 3 years believing that all white men were liars, that promises from them were weapons designed to lull you into vulnerability before the killing blow. And here was Elijah Stone, sitting in a jail cell, having surrendered a fortune to prove that some promises were kept even when keeping them cost everything. "I have to go to Denver," Nia said. "Miss Ashkey, that's exactly what Blackwood wants," Frank protested. "You show up in Denver and he'll arrest you immediately. That's the whole point of arresting Stone, to draw you out." "I know," Nia said, "but Elijah Stone is in that jail because of me, because he chose to protect me when it would have been easier and safer to look away. I will not hide here while he suffers for my sake. That is not the Apache way. That is not my way." "Then we go together," Rosa said firmly, "and we go smart. Not riding into Denver like we're surrendering, but with a plan, with witnesses, with enough noise that Blackwood can't make us disappear quietly." They spent the rest of the night planning. Frank would ride ahead to alert Harrison Webb and arrange for friendly journalists to be present. Rosa would contact church groups she had worked with, people who had supported her mixed heritage community and who might be sympathetic to Nia's cause. Thomas would gather the other ranch hands, men who worked for Stone and who would stand with him against corrupt authority. And Nia would prepare herself for the possibility that going to Denver might mean walking into a trap from which there was no escape. But she would walk into it with her eyes open and her head high, the way her father Cochise had taught her, the way her mother had faced the burning lodge to save children. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of fear, for something larger than yourself. 2 days later, a convoy left Silver Pine Ranch heading for Denver. It consisted of 3 wagons, 24 riders, and enough determination to move mountains, if mountains needed moving. Nia rode at the front, mounted on the gray Mustang stallion that had become hers through simple habit and mutual respect. She wore her traditional Apache dress, but had added a vest that Rosa had insisted on, practical leather that would turn a knife if necessary. The journey to Denver took 4 days of hard travel. As they drew closer to the city, more people joined their procession. Miners who had worked in Stone's operations and who respected him as a fair boss. Shopkeepers who had done business with him and found him honest when honesty was rare. Even a few society ladies from Denver's upper crust who had known Margaret Stone and who remembered Elijah as a devoted husband. By the time they reached the outskirts of Denver, their group had swelled to over 70 people, and word of their arrival ran ahead of them like wildfire through dry grass. Judge Thaddeus Blackwood heard about the approaching convoy while sitting in his office, reviewing the legal documents that would allow him to seize Stone's mine and property. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with silver hair and a face that would have been handsome if not for the cold calculation that lived behind his eyes. When his clerk informed him that an Apache woman was leading a small army toward Denver, he allowed himself a thin smile. "Perfect," he said. "She's doing exactly what I wanted. The moment she sets foot in this city, I'll have her arrested for inciting rebellion and conspiracy. Stone will rot in jail. I'll acquire his mine through legal seizure, and the Apache problem will be solved with a nice public hanging that will make me look tough on Indian aggression." Sometimes things work out better than planned. But Judge Blackwood had made a critical error, one that men of his temperament often make. He had assumed that legal power was the same as actual power, that because he controlled the courts, he controlled the outcome. He had failed to account for the power of public opinion, of moral witness, and of people who had simply had enough of corruption masquerading as justice. When Naya's convoy reached the Denver courthouse, they found not an empty square but a crowd of several hundred people. Some were hostile, carrying signs demanding Indian removal and territorial security. But others, more than Blackwood had anticipated, carried different signs. Signs calling for fair treatment. Signs quoting scripture about justice and mercy. Signs bearing Margaret Stone's name and demanding that her widower be released. Harrison Webb, Stone's lawyer, stood on the courthouse steps. He was a man of 60 with a shock of white hair and a voice that could fill a courtroom or a public square with equal effectiveness. When he saw Naya approaching, he raised his hands for quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen of Denver," he began, "today we witness a question being answered. The question is simple. Does the law exist to protect the powerful and punish the weak? Or does it exist to ensure justice for all people, regardless of their race, their wealth, or their connections?" Elijah Stone sits in a cell in this building, arrested not for any crime, but for the offense of keeping his word to a woman who needed help. Nia Ashkey stands before you now, not as a criminal, not as a savage, but as a human being asking for the same rights and protections that the law promises to everyone. Judge Blackwood emerged onto the steps, flanked by sheriff's deputies. His face was composed, but Naya could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. "This woman is wanted for questioning regarding crimes committed in New Mexico territory. She will be taken into custody immediately." "On what charges?" Webb demanded. "And with what evidence? You have issued no formal indictment. You have presented no witnesses. You are using the law as a club to beat down anyone who challenges your authority." "I am enforcing territorial security," Blackwood shot back. "This woman is Apache. Her father killed American soldiers. She herself has been identified as participating in raids." "I have killed men," Nia said, her voice ringing clear across the square. "I killed them in defense of my people, in defense of my home, in battles your soldiers brought to us. But I have murdered no one. I have not raided for pleasure or profit. Everything I have done was for survival." "Can you say the same, Judge Blackwood? Can you claim that everything you have done was for justice rather than personal gain?" The crowd murmured, the sound growing louder. Blackwood's face went red. "You dare question my integrity? You, a savage who should be grateful we allow you to live?" "I question the integrity of any man who uses his power to persecute those weaker than himself," Naya said. She stepped forward, close enough now that Blackwood could see the absolute lack of fear in her eyes. "You want to arrest me? Do it. But know that Elijah Stone gave me the resources to fight you. Not with guns or violence, but with the same law you are trying to use against us. I may be Apache, but I am no longer powerless. And you, Judge Blackwood, are no longer untouchable." For a moment, it seemed the situation would explode into violence. Blackwood's deputies reached for their weapons. Men in the crowd began pushing forward. But then a new voice cut through the case, a voice accustomed to command and used to being obeyed. "Everybody stand down, right now." A man in a military uniform pushed through the crowd. He was perhaps 55 years old, with gray hair and a face weathered by years of frontier service. The insignia on his uniform identified him as a colonel in the U.S. Army. Behind him came a contingent of 20 soldiers in full uniform, their presence transforming the square into something approaching a military operation. "I am Colonel William Mackenzie," the officer announced. "I command Fort Lowell, and I have been authorized by the territorial governor to investigate claims of judicial corruption in this court. Judge Blackwood, you are hereby relieved of all duties pending a full inquiry into your conduct. Any arrests or legal actions you have initiated in the past 30 days are suspended until their legitimacy can be verified." Blackwood's face went from red to white. "This is outrageous. You have no authority." "I have the authority of the territorial governor and the blessing of the Department of War," Mackenzie said. He produced a document, properly sealed and signed. "I also have sworn affidavits from 12 witnesses detailing your pattern of corruption, bribery, and abuse of office. Elijah Stone may have been the one you arrested, but he was not the only one you wronged. And unlike your previous victims, he had the resources to fight back properly." Mackenzie turned to Naya. "Miss Ashkey, I knew your father. I fought against him for 5 years, and I respected him more than most men I fought beside. He was an honorable enemy, which is a rare thing in this world. I give you my word that you will receive fair treatment under military jurisdiction until this matter is resolved." Nia studied Mackenzie's face, looking for deception or hidden agenda. She found only wary honor, the kind that comes from decades of service and the knowledge that duty sometimes demands uncomfortable compromises. "Your word, Colonel. I will trust it until you break it. But know that if you do break it, there will be consequences." "I would expect nothing less from Cochise's daughter," Mackenzie said with a slight smile. The next 2 hours dissolved into a chaos of legal procedure and bureaucratic maneuvering. Blackwood was formally suspended and placed under house arrest pending investigation. Elijah Stone was released from his cell, thinner and more exhausted but unbroken. The charges against both him and Naya were formally dropped, though Mackenzie made it clear that a longer conversation about Apache treaty rights would need to happen soon. When Elijah finally emerged from the courthouse, the afternoon sun caught his face, emphasizing the new lines that a week in jail had carved around his eyes. He scanned the crowd, and when his gaze found Naya, something in his expression shifted. Not relief exactly, but a kind of desperate hope that she would understand why he had done what he did. Nia walked toward him through the crowd, which parted to let her pass. She stopped 3 feet away, close enough to speak without shouting, but maintaining distance. Always maintaining distance. "You gave up your freedom for this. You sat in that jail cell, not knowing if you would ever get out, all because you refused to surrender me to Blackwood." "I did," Elijah said simply, "because my word needed proving, and wealth is meaningless if I don't use it for something that matters." "That was either the bravest thing or the most foolish thing I have ever witnessed," Nia said. "I have not yet decided which. Can it be both?" For the first time since they had met, Nia smiled. It was a small smile, barely a curve of lips, but it transformed her face from something carved from stone into something human and vulnerable. "Perhaps, but you should know, Elijah Stone, I came to Denver not because of the money or the mine. I came because you were in jail because of me. My people do not abandon those who stand with us, even if those people are foolish white men who give away fortunes." Elijah felt something in his chest that had been frozen for 5 years begin to thaw. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of connection, of understanding, of building something together from the wreckage of their separate griefs. "Then I am honored to have foolishly stood by," he said. The crowd around them began to disperse, people returning to their lives now that the drama had resolved itself into something approaching justice. Harrison Webb approached, his legal robes billowing in the wind. "Elijah, Miss Ashkey, we need to discuss next steps. Colonel Mackenzie has proposed a formal negotiation regarding Apache treaty rights, land grants, and reparations. It's an unprecedented opportunity, but it will require careful handling." "Then we handle it carefully," Elijah said. He looked at Naya. "Together, if you're willing." Naya considered the question. Everything in her experience told her to remain suspicious, to maintain distance, to trust no one fully. But Elijah Stone had just spent a week in jail and given away a fortune to prove his word was solid. At some point, she had to decide whether to honor that proof or remain forever locked in the armor of her trauma. The Denver courthouse conference room smelled of old leather and expensive cigars, the kind of room designed to remind anyone who entered that power resided here, and you were present only by invitation. But Nia Ashke walked through those doors wearing her full Apache ceremonial dress, turquoise and silver beadwork catching the morning light, her bearing that of someone who understood she was the granddaughter of a chief and owed deference to no one. Elijah Stone walked beside her, not ahead, not behind, in the new gray suit he had purchased specifically for this occasion, because his old clothes still carried the dust of jail cells and desperation. Colonel William Mackenzie sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by territorial officials whose expressions ranged from barely concealed hostility to cautious curiosity. Harrison Webb occupied a chair to Elijah's right, surrounded by stacks of legal documents that represented 3 months of exhaustive research into treaty law and precedent. The air was thick with tension and the weight of history about to be written. The week following Elijah's release had been a whirlwind of preparation. Harrison Webb worked 16-hour days, drafting legal arguments and researching precedents. Elijah met with journalists, businessmen, and anyone whose voice might sway public opinion. And Nia studied. She read treaty documents until her eyes burned, practiced legal terminology with Rosa, and memorized the arguments Webb believed would be most persuasive. On the morning of this conference, she had risen before dawn to perform a traditional Apache blessing ceremony, asking her ancestors for strength and clarity. Elijah had found her on the hotel balcony, watching the sun rise over Denver's growing skyline, and had simply stood beside her in silence until Rosa called them for breakfast. Now, seated at this imposing table surrounded by men who held her people's fate in their documents and decisions, Nia felt the weight of history pressing down like the summer heat had pressed down at Red Mesa. But she also felt Elijah's presence beside her, solid and unwavering. She was not alone. She had never been truly alone since the moment he had knelt in the dust to unlock her shackles. "Gentlemen and Miss Ashke," Mackenzie began, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded troops in battle and negotiated peace in its aftermath. "We are here because the current situation is untenable. The Apache have legitimate grievances. Treaties have been made and broken with a frequency that shames us. I propose we stop the cycle of broken promises and create something that actually works." A heavy-set man named Garrett, whose fortune came from land speculation in former Apache territory, leaned forward with poorly disguised contempt. "Colonel, with respect, the Apache have been hostile for decades. They've killed settlers, burned ranches, and refused every attempt at peaceful relocation. Why should we reward that behavior with land and resources?" Nia's eyes, dark as obsidian, fixed on Garrett with an intensity that made several men shift uncomfortably. When she spoke, her English was flawless, her tone measured, but carrying an edge sharp enough to draw blood. "My father, Cochise, fought your government for 12 years. Do you know why, Mr. Garrett? Because a treaty promised us land, then white men found gold and decided the treaty was inconvenient. Because your soldiers invited Apache leaders to a peace conference, then hanged them without trial because every promise your government made was written in ink that disappeared the moment keeping it became difficult. We did not start this war. We simply refused to die quietly." The silence that followed was electric. Mackenzie, who had fought against Cochise for years before the great chief's death, nodded slowly. "Miss Ashke speaks truth, uncomfortable though it may be. The historical record supports her account. We have violated every major treaty with the Apache. Their violence, while tragic, was born from legitimate desperation. If we want peace, genuine peace, we must acknowledge these failures and make genuine restitution." Another official, younger and more pragmatic than Garrett, spoke up. "What exactly are you proposing?" Harrison Webb opened the leather portfolio before him and withdrew a document thick enough to represent serious legal work. "A comprehensive treaty, properly ratified by Congress and the territorial government. 10,000 acres in the San Carlos region, with water rights, mineral rights, and timber access. Federal funding for educational facilities, medical care, and agricultural development for an initial period of 5 years, with renewal contingent on measurable success. Most significantly, recognition of Apache sovereignty within treaty boundaries, meaning territorial law applies only through Apache consent and established dispute resolution mechanisms. Garrett's face went purple. You're asking us to create a sovereign nation inside our territory and hand over resources that could support white settlers. This is madness. Elijah's voice when he spoke was cold as winter ice. Mr. Garrett, your personal fortune was built on land purchased for pennies after it was seized from Apache families who had lived there for generations. Every acre you own, every dollar you've made, comes from legalized theft. So spare me your outrage about fairness. How dare you, Garrett sputtered. You've betrayed your own race, Stone. Spending time with that Apache woman has rotted your judgment. Elijah stood, his hands flat on the polished table, his gray eyes burning with controlled fury that was somehow more frightening than rage. That Apache woman has more honor in her smallest finger than exists in your entire corrupt body. And if you insult her again, I will ensure every newspaper in Denver knows exactly how you acquired your land holdings. I have bank records, forged deeds, and bribery receipts that would end your career and your freedom. Don't test me. Mackenzie raised his hand before the situation could deteriorate into violence. Gentlemen, focus. Miss Ashkey, these terms are generous by any standard. What assurance can you provide that the Apache will honor this treaty when previous agreements have failed on both sides? Naya stood, matching Elijah's posture, her presence filling the room despite being the only woman and the only Apache present. Colonel Mackenzie, every treaty that failed was broken first by your government. The Apache kept our word until your word proved worthless. But I will give you this assurance. If you grant us land, resources, and genuine autonomy, I personally guarantee that no Apache under my influence will raise arms against settlers or soldiers, except in clear self-defense. I will establish schools where our children learn both Apache traditions and English language, so future generations can negotiate as equals. I will build hospitals that blend our traditional medicine with your modern techniques. And I will create a community that proves the Apache can prosper without war, if only you give us the space to try. And if warriors reject your leadership, Mackenzie pressed, if some choose the old ways of raiding, then I will stop them myself, Naya said, and every man in the room heard the absolute conviction in her voice. I am daughter of Cochise. I carry his authority and the weight of his legacy. Any Apache who violates this treaty will answer to me before they answer to you. This I swear on my father's grave and my mother's memory. The room fell into profound silence. Men who had spent decades thinking of Apache as savages, incapable of civilization, were confronted with a woman who spoke their language better than some of them, understood legal complexities they barely grasped, and offered terms that were both reasonable and achievable. Mackenzie looked around the table, reading faces, calculating political costs against potential benefits. Finally, he nodded. I will recommend this treaty to the territorial governor and to Washington. I cannot guarantee approval, but I can guarantee your proposal receives serious consideration. That is more than the Apache have received in 3 decades. Then it is a beginning, Nia said. Sometimes a beginning is all that is possible. The meeting adjourned with handshakes ranging from genuine to perfunctory. As officials filed out, some still muttering about the dangers of giving Indians autonomy, Elijah and Naya remained with Harrison Webb and Colonel Mackenzie. You handled that brilliantly, Mackenzie said to Nia. Your father would have been proud. He was a warrior without equal, but he understood when talking was more powerful than fighting. You have his wisdom. My father would have preferred I never needed to negotiate with those who stole our land, Naya said bluntly. But he was also pragmatic. He knew when to fight and when to build. I am learning the same lesson, though it tastes bitter. Peace usually does, Mackenzie said quietly. War is simple. Peace requires compromise, and compromise always feels like betrayal. But it's worth pursuing. Webb began gathering documents. This will take months, possibly years. There will be opposition in Congress, resistance from settlers, legal challenges from men like Garrett. You need to prepare for a long fight. We will fight it, Elijah said. He looked at Naya, and something passed between them that needed no words. Together. The journey back to Silver Pine Ranch took 6 days through country that was transforming from autumn gold to winter gray. They traveled with Frank and Thomas as guards, Rosa in one of the wagons managing supplies with her usual efficiency, and Naya and Elijah on horseback. The mountains rose around them like ancient witnesses, snow already claiming the highest peaks, promising that winter would come early and stay late. On the fourth night, camped beside a creek that whispered over smooth stones worn by countless seasons, Nia sat apart from the fire staring at stars so numerous they looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet. Elijah approached slowly, giving her space to refuse his company, but she said nothing, so he sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "What troubles you?" Elijah asked after they had sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. "I am thinking about what my father would say," Naya replied, "about negotiating with white men, accepting their schools and hospitals, choosing diplomacy over the warrior's path. Would he see me as wise or as a coward who surrendered what he died defending?" "Your father made peace in the end," Elijah said gently. "He signed treaties, moved to reservation land, tried to find a way forward that didn't require constant war. He was pragmatic enough to recognize when fighting had become futile." "Yes," Nia agreed, her voice heavy. "But he died 4 years later, heartbroken that the peace he negotiated was already being violated. The reservation was nothing like promised. Poor land, contaminated water, insufficient rations. He spent his final years watching his people starve slowly instead of dying quickly in battle. Was that wisdom or just slower defeat?" Elijah had no easy answer because none existed. The history was written in blood and broken promises, and pretending otherwise dishonored everyone who had suffered. So instead he offered the only truth he possessed. "I cannot change what was done. I cannot undo the broken treaties or resurrect the dead, but I can help you build something different. Not a return to what was, because that's impossible, but something new that honors your father's strength and your mother's compassion. A place where Apache children learn their language and traditions while also learning skills to survive in this changing world. Is that defeat? Or is that adaptation, which every people must achieve to endure?" Naya turned to look at him fully, starlight illuminating tears on her cheeks she had not bothered to hide. "You ask difficult questions, Elijah Stone. Questions with answers that hurt to speak." "Then don't answer tonight," Elijah said. "Tonight, just sit here with me and know that whatever your ancestors think, I believe you are doing something extraordinarily brave. Maybe the bravest thing possible. Choosing hope over despair, when hope seems foolish." Naya leaned toward him, and Elijah lifted his arm in invitation. She settled against his shoulder, her body initially tense but gradually relaxing as minutes passed and no threat materialized. They sat like that for an hour, neither speaking, just existing together in a moment of peace, stolen from a world determined to deny them such moments. When they finally returned to the fire, Rosa looked up from her mending and smiled knowingly, saying nothing but understanding everything. They reached Silver Pine Ranch on a gray afternoon when clouds hung low enough to brush mountain peaks. The ranch looked different to Nia now, not like a prison or refuge, but like something she had not felt in years. Home. Not the home of her childhood, but a different kind, built on choices rather than birth accident. The house stood solid and well-maintained, smoke rising from the chimney where Rosa had obviously arrived ahead to prepare for their return. But as they rode into the yard, Elijah reined in his horse and sat for a moment, just looking at the structure. "When I built this house," Elijah said quietly, "I built it for Margaret and Sarah. Every room designed with them in mind. After they died, I could not bear to change anything. It became a tomb, a shrine to grief. But perhaps it is time to let it be something else, something living." He dismounted and walked to the porch, Naya following. He opened the front door, but instead of entering, turned to her. "There is something I need to show you. Something I should have shown you weeks ago, but I was not ready. I think I am ready now." He led her upstairs to a room she had never entered, a room that remained locked though Elijah claimed to hate locked doors. He withdrew a small brass key and opened the door. The room beyond took Naya's breath away. It was a child's room, perfectly preserved, untouched by 5 years. A small bed with a quilt covered in embroidered flowers. A dollhouse with intricate details. Shelves lined with well-worn books. And on the dresser, a music box, a hairbrush with blonde strands still caught in the bristles, and a photograph of a little girl with gray eyes and a smile that could banish darkness. Sarah's room, Elijah said, his voice rough with barely controlled emotion. I have not moved a single item since the day she died. I have dusted, kept it clean, but not let it change. I have been holding on to her so tightly I have been strangling her memory rather than honoring it. Naya walked slowly into the room, fingers trailing over the dollhouse, the books, the music box. She could feel the love that had created this space, but also the grief that had frozen it in amber. Why show me this now? Because I need to let her go, Elijah said. Not forget her, never that, but let her rest peacefully instead of keeping her trapped as a monument to my guilt. And I cannot do that alone. He crossed to the dresser and opened a small drawer, withdrawing a wooden doll carved by hand. The details were exquisite, but the face remained unfinished, features roughed in, but never completed. I started carving this the day after the funeral. I told myself I would finish it, would complete one last gift even though she was gone, but I could not finish the face. Every time I tried, my hands would shake and I would put it away. 5 years, Nia, 5 years, unable to complete this doll, because finishing it meant accepting she was truly gone. Naya took the doll, studied the workmanship, the love evident in every carefully carved detail except that blank face. What will you do with it? Finish it, Elijah said, but not as Sarah, as an Apache girl, with features honoring your people, your strength, your survival. I will give it to you, not as a replacement for anything lost, but as a symbol of what can be built from grief. Something new that remembers the past, but does not live in it. Tears ran down Naya's face, hot and unexpected. You would do this? Transform your daughter's gift into something for me? I think Sarah would have liked you, Elijah said softly. She was fierce and kind and curious. She would have asked you 1,000 questions about Apache life, about everything. And Margaret would have welcomed you as family. So yes, I will finish the doll, for Sarah's memory, for you, and for the future we are building together. Naya stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Elijah, the first time she had initiated such contact. I am so tired of losing people, she whispered. I am so tired of grief and anger and fear. I want to feel something else. Hope, possibility, maybe eventually something more. Elijah held her carefully, as if she were precious and fragile, though he knew she was neither. Then let us feel those things together. No more running from life because death has marked us. Let us choose to live, fully and honestly, whatever that costs. They stood in Sarah's room, two people carved by loss into shapes that should not fit together, but somehow did. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, soft and silent, covering the ranch in white that transformed the familiar landscape into something new. The weeks that followed established a rhythm neither had anticipated, but both came to cherish. Elijah spent mornings on ranch business and mine operations, but afternoons were devoted to carving. He set up a workspace in the barn and worked on the doll with painstaking care. Nia would join him, sitting nearby, working on beading patterns or crafting traditional Apache tools for the school she dreamed of building. They talked during these quiet hours, sharing stories. Elijah spoke of his early years as a poor miner, the backbreaking work, the constant danger. He told her about meeting Margaret at a church social, how she had been above his station but had not cared, how she had taught him to see beauty beyond mere survival. Nia spoke of her childhood in Apache homeland, learning to track with her father, learning medicine with her mother. The freedom of life lived close to the land. She spoke of Nietzsche, her lost love, and how they had planned a future stolen by soldiers. She spoke of rage that had sustained her through years of running and fighting, and how that rage was slowly being replaced by something more complicated. Rosa watched these developing bonds with satisfaction, someone who had hoped for exactly this, but had been too wise to force it. The weeks following their return from Denver settled into a comfortable rhythm. Elijah worked mornings in his study, managing the remaining business affairs before the move to Arizona. Afternoons belonged to his carving, the wooden doll taking shape with painstaking care. Naya spent her days learning the ranch, understanding every fence line and water source, preparing herself mentally for the work that lay ahead in Arizona. As winter deepened and the first snows began to fall, Rosa suggested they celebrate Christmas together, a holiday Nia had never experienced. It would be a small gathering, just the ranch hands and a few trusted friends from the surrounding area. Together, they baked bread, prepared preserves, and decorated the house with pine boughs that filled the rooms with the scent of winter forest. It was in mid-December, as they were preparing for the celebration, that Harrison Webb's most significant letter arrived. Frank brought it from town, his face troubled. The envelope bore the territorial government seal and was addressed to both Elijah Stone and Nia Ashkey. They opened it together in Elijah's study, Rosa standing nearby. Harrison Webb's precise handwriting covered 3 pages, and as they read, their expressions shifted from curiosity to disbelief to cautious hope. The treaty had been approved. Not fully, not without modifications, but the core remained intact. The Apache would receive 8,000 acres in San Carlos, somewhat less than requested, but still substantial. Federal funding for schools and hospitals was approved for 5 years with possible extension. Most importantly, Apache sovereignty within treaty boundaries had been recognized, with formal mechanisms for resolving disputes between Apache law and territorial law. But there was more. Judge Thaddeus Blackwood had been formally removed from the bench and faced criminal charges for bribery, fraud, and abuse of office. Buck Reeves had been stripped of his bounty hunter license and was in jail awaiting trial. The letter concluded with a personal note. Elijah, Miss Ashkey, what you have accomplished is remarkable. You took a situation that should have ended in tragedy and transformed it into opportunity for genuine change. The treaty is not perfect, but perfection was never possible. What matters is that it exists, achieved through law rather than violence, providing foundation for something better. I am honored to have played a small role in this victory. Nia set the letter down with trembling hands. It is real. They actually agreed. They agreed, Elijah confirmed, his voice unsteady. You have land for your people, resources to build with, legal recognition of Apache rights. Everything you paid for, Nia corrected. The mine you gave me, that money bought influence, bought attention, bought a seat at the negotiating table. Our sacrifice, Elijah said. You gave up safety to stand beside me in Denver. You negotiated with men who saw you as less than human and never backed down. This victory belongs to both of us. Rosa, silent until now, spoke with earned authority. This victory belongs to you together, which means you are bonded whether you admit it or not. So I will ask what both of you have been avoiding. What happens next? Will Miss Ashkey go to Arizona alone? Will Elijah stay here? Will you separate after everything you have built together? The silence was profound. Nia and Elijah looked at each other, and in that look was every conversation shared, every moment of vulnerability, every quiet hour spent working side by side. Finally, Nia spoke. I must go to Arizona. My people need leadership to turn treaties into reality, but I do not want to go alone. She struggled with the words, unaccustomed to admitting need. I want Elijah to come with me, not as protector or benefactor, but as partner, as someone who stands beside me because he chooses to, not because he has to. Elijah crossed the room and took both Nia's hands. I will come. I will sell my share of mine operations to Webb, keep only enough to fund the Arizona work. I will leave this ranch in Rosa's capable hands, and I will stand beside you as we build something unprecedented. You would give up everything here? Nia asked. This house, this land, the life you built with Margaret? I am not giving it up, Elijah said gently. I am honoring it by living the values Margaret taught me. She believed in justice, in helping those who needed help. Coming with you to Arizona, building schools and hospitals, ensuring this treaty is kept, that is exactly what she would have wanted. I am not abandoning her memory. I am finally living up to it. Nia nodded, tears streaming down her face unchecked. Then we will go together. But first, there is something I must do. She went to her room and returned carrying the leather pouch holding her most precious possessions. From it, she withdrew a necklace of turquoise and silver, intricate work speaking of master craftsmanship and deep cultural significance. This was my father's, given to him by his father and to him by his father before. It is meant for leaders, for those who carry responsibility for the people. I want you to have it. Elijah started to protest, but Nia held up her hand. You are not Apache by birth, but you have proven yourself Apache by choice. You have fought for my people, sacrificed for them, honored them when your society demanded you despise them. In my tradition, that makes you one of us. I give you this necklace, and with it a name. Tsekeigi, Man of the Silver Mountain. You are no longer just Elijah Stone. With shaking hands, Naya placed the necklace around Elijah's neck. The turquoise settled against his chest, the silver catching lamplight, and somehow it looked right, as if it had always belonged there. I do not have something equal to give, Elijah said. You have already given me everything that matters, Naya said softly. Freedom when I was enslaved, trust when I had none, hope when I had forgotten what hope felt like. A future, Elijah said. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the wooden doll, now complete. The face was beautifully carved, clearly Apache in features, with an expression of strength and determination remarkably like Nia herself. I finished it, not as replacement for Sarah, but as symbol of what we are building, a bridge between worlds, between grief and hope, between past and future. I give it to you with my promise. I will stand beside you. I will fight beside you. And when the world tries to tear us apart, as it surely will, I will hold on with everything I have. Naya took the doll, cradling it like the precious thing it was. Then I give you my promise in return. I walk beside you, not behind, not ahead. I carry your burdens as you carry mine. And when doubt comes, I will remember this moment and know that some promises are kept even when keeping them costs everything. They stood facing each other, two people from worlds that should have remained forever separate, bound now by shared trauma, shared hope, and something deeper neither quite dared to name. Outside, snow fell harder, transforming Silver Pine Ranch into a landscape of white silence, beautiful and clean and full of possibility. Elijah lifted his hand and gently touched Nia's face, fingers tracing the scar on her forehead. May I? Yes, Nia whispered. Their kiss was gentle at first, tentative, two people learning each other without words. But it deepened quickly, becoming more urgent, a physical expression of emotion carefully contained for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Naya was smiling that rare smile that transformed her face. So, she said with rare humor, this is what white people call courting. This is what I call falling in love with the bravest woman I have ever met, Elijah said, and hoping she might feel something similar. I feel, Naya said carefully, testing the words, like I have found something I did not know I was searching for, like coming home to a place I have never been. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Elijah said, because I feel exactly the same way. The responses came slowly, some hopeful, many skeptical, all cautious after generations of broken promises. By the time the worst of winter began to break and the first hints of spring touched the high country, word had spread throughout the Apache world. Cochise's daughter was keeping a promise, and for people who had learned to expect only broken promises, that alone was worth investigating. In early spring, as snow melted and first green shoots appeared, a convoy departed Silver Pine Ranch heading south toward Arizona. 3 wagons loaded with supplies, a dozen workers who had volunteered to help, Elijah and Naya on horseback, and Rosa, who insisted she was not too old to see this through. The journey took 3 weeks through terrain, shifting from mountain valleys to high desert to red rock country where Apache had lived for generations. As they traveled, more people joined them. Apache, who heard Cochise's daughter, was returning with resources and purpose. Mexican families fleeing southern poverty, even white families drawn by promise of fair wages and chance to be part of something unprecedented. By the time they reached the 8,000 acres, their group had swollen to over 200 souls, a community being born from shared purpose rather than shared heritage. The land was beautiful in the way harsh places are, red earth and scattered juniper, mesas rising like ancient fortresses. There was water from springs feeding a creek. There was game and timber and stone. It was not paradise, but it was possibility. They established first structures on a broad, flat area near the creek. Elijah and construction crews began with the school, a long, low building of adobe and wood. Nia worked alongside them, her hands blistering as she learned skills Apache women traditionally did not practice, but which the New World required. Rosa established kitchen and infirmary in a large tent. She trained both Apache and white volunteers in a mixture of traditional healing and modern medicine, creating a hybrid approach more effective than either alone. The work was brutal, days starting before dawn and ending after dark, hands that bled and backs that screamed with exhaustion. Disputes between Apache and white workers over methods and traditions threatened to tear the fragile community apart. But slowly, painfully, the community took shape. The school was completed by midsummer, built with Apache and Mexican architectural elements blended seamlessly. The hospital followed, then homes, then a community center. Nia taught in the school during mornings, instructing children in both Apache traditions and English literacy. Elijah handled administration, managing budgets, negotiating with territorial officials. In evenings, they would collapse together in the small house they had built, too tired to do more than hold each other. It was during one exhausted evening, as summer turned toward autumn, that Naya made an announcement changing everything. "I am pregnant." Elijah, reviewing supply lists, went completely still. Then he set down his papers with exaggerated care. "Are you certain?" "Rosa confirmed it yesterday, 3 months along. The baby will come in late winter." Elijah crossed the room and knelt before Naya, taking her hands, searching her face. "How do you feel?" "Terrified," Naya admitted. "My mother died when I was 18. I have no elder women of my family to guide me. And I am bringing a child into a world that still sees Apache as enemies. But I am also hopeful. This child will be born free, raised with both our traditions, knowing from the beginning that love can exist across the divides the world tries to build." "Then we face it together," Elijah said, "as we have faced everything." He placed his hand on Naya's still flat stomach, and something shifted in his expression, some final piece of grief letting go. He was going to be a father again. Not a replacement for Sarah, but something new, built on the foundation of loss but not consumed by it. The child, a girl, was born on a February morning when the sun rose clear and cold. The labor was difficult, long hours leaving Naya exhausted, and Elijah wrecked with helpless worry. But Rosa, assisted by an Apache midwife, guided both mother and baby through safely. When Elijah was finally allowed into the room, he found Naya propped in bed, face pale but eyes bright with fierce, protective love. In her arms was a tiny bundle, and when she pulled back the blanket, Elijah saw his daughter. She was perfect. A tiny face holding features from both parents, skin the color of warm honey, a shock of dark hair, and when she opened her eyes, they were gray. Elijah's eyes, in an Apache face, a living bridge between worlds. "What shall we name her?" Elijah asked, voice rough with emotion. "I have been thinking," Naya said. "We should honor both traditions. I want to name her Sarah for your daughter who died. But her Apache name will be Ashkey, which means both girl and hope, depending on how it is spoken. Sarah Ashkey Stone. She carries all of us in her name." Elijah sat carefully on the bed's edge and looked down at this impossible gift. A second chance at fatherhood. A daughter embodying everything he and Naya had fought to build. "Hello, Sarah," he whispered. "Welcome to the world. Your mother and I have made you a place here. Not perfect, because perfection does not exist, but a place where you will be loved, where you will be free, where you will learn that the divisions the world sees are not as deep as they pretend." 3 years passed. The community grew steadily. The school expanded, requiring additional teachers. The hospital treated not just the settlement, but neighboring ranches, building reputation for quality care regardless of patients' race. Trade relationships developed with surrounding communities. Sarah grew from infant to toddler to small child, with her mother's fierce spirit and her father's thoughtful nature. She spoke both English and Apache fluently, moved comfortably between cultures, and was loved by everyone as a symbol of what could be built when people chose cooperation. One late afternoon in the 4th year, Elijah and Naya sat on their porch watching Sarah play with other children, a mixed group who had grown up together and saw each other simply as friends. An eagle soared overhead, riding thermals with effortless grace. "We did it," Naya said softly. "Everything we promised. The school, hospital, treaty honored. We built something real." "Together," Elijah said firmly, "and look what we created." She gestured at the whole community. Apache elders teaching traditional skills to white children, Mexican families farming using techniques shared by all groups, a church holding Christian services, Apache ceremonies, and community meetings where everyone solved problems through discussion. It was not perfect. There were still prejudices, conflicts, moments when old hatreds flared. But more often, the community found ways to bridge divides, to remember they had chosen to live together for reasons that mattered more than differences. 40 years later, in 1918, an old man and old woman sat on a similar porch. The old man was 80, hair completely white, body bent with age but mind still sharp. The old woman was 64, hair streaked with gray, face lined by sun and wind and laughter. Their children were grown with families of their own. Sarah was a doctor trained at schools that initially refused to admit someone of mixed race. Cochise, named for Naya's father, was a lawyer fighting for Indian rights in federal courts. Grandchildren ran through the yard, 7 of them ranging from 3 to 15. They spoke 3 languages fluently, moved between cultures with ease, and carried in their existence proof that the divisions the world insisted on were artificial and permeable. Elijah took Naya's hand, fingers intertwining in a gesture requiring no thought. Do you ever regret it? The choices we made? The paths we walked? Naya was quiet, considering with proper seriousness. Then she smiled, that rare smile that had become more common but never lost its power. I regret the losses. I regret my parents could not see what we built. I regret the world required so much pain before allowing even this small measure of justice. But the choices themselves, never. You gave me freedom when I was enslaved. I gave you purpose when you were drowning in grief. Together, we built something that will outlast us. That is enough. More than enough, Elijah agreed. He looked across the community at the life they had created through determination and faith and love, refusing to be limited by boundaries others imposed. The stars are beautiful tonight. They are always beautiful, Nia said. The campfires of our ancestors, watching over us, judging whether we honored their sacrifices. And, Elijah asked with gentle humor, do we pass? Nia squeezed his hand. I think so. I think they see what we built and understand we did the best we could, that we turned promises into reality, that we chose love over hatred even when hatred seemed easier and more justified. As they sat together in gathering darkness, an eagle called from the mesas, its cry echoing across the valley, wild and free and unafraid. And in that moment, Elijah and Naya knew with absolute certainty that the journey had been worth every sacrifice, every struggle, every moment of doubt. They had built a bridge between worlds, and on that bridge their children and grandchildren walked with confidence. The story that began with violence and captivity had ended with freedom and love. And while the world beyond remained complicated and often cruel, within Eagle's Rest, people had learned that old divides could be crossed, ancient hatreds could be set down, and something better could be built by those brave enough to triumph. The eagle called again, blessing and benediction, and 2 old people who had every reason for bitterness but had chosen hope smiled at each other in the darkness and knew they had done well.